All right, good morning, everybody. This is Brendan Jordan with the Great Plains Institute, and I want to welcome you all to Drive the Future, Best Practices for Equitable Transportation Electrification in the Midcontinent. This event is a co-hosted event by the Great Plains Institute and EVHybridNoire. And so I want to, in addition to welcoming you myself, want to also introduce our co-host, Terry Travis with EVHybridNoire, to offer a welcome as well.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Glad to have you all here joining us for this very important conversation today, and looking forward to the dialogue. I think it'll be very insightful and very helpful as we begin to, move forward in this conversation of, beneficial and equitable transportation electrification.
Thanks a lot, Terry, and we're honored to have the opportunity to co-host with EVHybridNoire, a fantastic organization. Just a quick housekeeping. I want to thank the supporters of this of our work in this area, and that support makes this event possible. And moving straight into the agenda. So we're going to start with a panel discussion, and I'll introduce our panelists in just a moment. And we have a lot of time for Q&A with the panelists. We're going to have very short introductions from our panelists and really focus on asking them questions and just learning about their experience in equitable transportation electrification. Then we're going to move into breakout groups, and this is our opportunity to hear from you and try to collect the shared wisdom of this group. And so we have breakout rooms focused on different topics: utility programs, state policy, charging infrastructure, climate justice and public health, and workforce development, and then some brief closing discussion. And so with no further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and mostly let them introduce themselves. And so, starting with Terry Travis, who you've just met, who you may already know. He is the co-founder of EVHybridNoire. Terry.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Just really quickly to keep things moving. EVNoire is the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts, and we work in a number of the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts, with members and chapters across the country and internationally. And we work in the areas of advocacy for beneficial public policy, increase multimodal EV access and access to charging infrastructure, research, data analysis, and monitoring. We think that is a critically important area of this, ensuring that folks have access to innovative financing practices and others. But, really glad to be here. I think that we'll get into more of the work that we do and more of our areas of focus in these conversations, but glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation and dialogue.
All right, thanks, Terry. Our next panelist is Isa Gaillard, and Isa is the Transformative Communities Program Manager at the Greenlining Institute. Isa.
Thanks, Brendan. Good morning, everybody. Really excited to be here. I'm coming from Michigan. Actually, I'm based out of Kalamazoo, Michigan, but the organization I work with is the Greenlining Institute, and we're an Oakland-based nonprofit that is dedicated to reversing the harms of redlining. We do this through policy advocacy, research, leadership development, and we focus in the environment, transportation, technology, public health, and we really understand that all these issues are interconnected, and there are many deep-rooted issues that stem back to redlining. And so we're constantly trying to find new and innovative ways to greenline our economy and greenline our communities. And I'm personally co-managing the Towards Equitable Electric Mobility Community of Practice project co-managed by Fourth, an organization based out of Oregon. And we're in our first year. We're really excited to be able to facilitate this project, which includes 4 states, Colorado, Illinois, Virginia, and North Carolina, in an effort to be able to share out best practices with with the rest of the country, and hopefully we can add additional states to our list, maybe even some mid-continental states at some point. And yeah, really trying to build a network of organizations that can really learn together and advance best practices towards equitable electric mobility. And so excited to be able to share out some of the learnings with this group today.
Fantastic. And our final panelist is Jamez Staples. Jamez is a social entrepreneur and the founder and owner of Renewable Energy Partners. Jamez.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Brendan. Jamez Staples. I'm, as mentioned, CEO of Renewable Energy Partners, which is a solar installation and development company based out of Minneapolis, North Minneapolis. And we also have Northgate Development, which is a real estate development firm, which was founded solely on the principle of bringing equitable training to the community to make it more accessible. Currently, the way that the training systems are currently set up, they are 2 hours away from what in Minneapolis, North Minneapolis is an economically challenged community where I intentionally live as a resident because I was born and raised there. And so my focus has been how do we merge the two of the economic opportunity of the clean energy revolution that's taking place, which includes EVs and the infrastructure, but also tying directly to workforce development, making sure that the opportunities meet the people and the people can get to where they need to go professionally. So thank you.
All right, fantastic. Well, we're just have a couple quick ground rules. This is pretty straightforward, but the process for the Q&A is to please ask questions in the chat. And we do have some of our own questions that we'll be asking the panelists, but really interested in hearing from you and making sure that we have some questions from participants. Please remain muted for the duration of the Q&A. We will do the Q&A via the chat function. Once you're in the breakout rooms, we will be asking everybody to unmute and turn on your video and be an active participant. But for this phase, we have a large number of participants on the call, so we're not able to unmute at this point. And that'll work a lot better in the breakout rooms. And just finally, just a quick housekeeping, this phase of the conversation will be recorded, but the breakout groups will not be. We will be taking notes in order to record the themes from those conversations, but we'll make a recording available of this panel. So with no further ado, I'd like to ask our first question, and this is a pretty high level question for our topic today, but how does your organization define equity? And we'll reverse the order here and maybe start with Jamez. And you're muted.
Still got to get the hang of this.
Of course, right?
So for me, equity is rooted in creating equal access and opportunity for everyone. The way I see it, the way my company, we're a private sector company. We are on both sides, right? So we've deviated from your traditional kind of everything in one, because there's a real estate component, which the whole focus was, how do we make sure that people have access, right? If you have a 2-hour commute to get to one class one way, I mean, that's not equitable, right? When people from various communities can get to these opportunity training spaces easier than others. And so when I look at it from as an African-American male who lives in an economically challenged community and seeing the fact that my community didn't necessarily have access to these programs, I said, this isn't right, this isn't fair. So and then from the other side, the private sector of the clean energy space and the developing projects and installing projects, I wanted to make sure people from my community had the opportunity to actively participate. For those of you that do not know, Minnesota has some of the worst disparities in the country. That's in education, income, home ownership, health, I mean, you name it. And when you aggregate those, whereas we're actually worse than Mississippi. So for me, equity was more so, how do we create an equitable opportunity amongst this global phenomenon of climate change? Climate change is going to impact a little bit of everybody, right? But it disparately impacts Black and brown people more than anyone globally. So the goal for me is like, how do we utilize this as a platform to create the jobs, right? And as well as the workforce that are negatively impacted, but also then they can utilize, you're tying the opportunity to the purse strings. The challenge with that is that the policies are now finally starting to align. We now have a president that's in place who has an interest in seeing equitable workforce, equitable things happening in their throughout the communities, while he's saying that these resources that are being allocated, 40% of them should go towards economically challenged and minority communities. So when we're talking about equity, for me, it's equity in terms of changing the narrative around who gets the jobs, who has access to the training, who's making money off of this stuff, and at the same time, the entrepreneurial aspect also.
All right, great, Jamez. How about Isa? How does your organization, how does Greenlining define equity?
Yeah, Greenlining really defines equity as a transformation of behaviors, institutions, and systems that disproportionately harm communities of color. And we work to make sure that a new world becomes possible, and that's how we view equity, as a world in which communities of color can build wealth, live in healthy places filled with economic opportunity, and are ready to confront the challenges posed by climate change. For us, the focus is on communities of color because we're a racial equity organization, although we recognize that there are many intersecting forms of equity, such as equity by class, ability, age, gender, and many other forms. And within the Community of Practice project that I co-manage, equity really is kind of defined as ensuring that the equity and environmental justice organizations that are part of our cohort are the decision makers in our process. So, the Community of Practice project is made up of EJ and equity groups, and then also some mainstream environmental organizations. And something that we really strive to do is make sure that the decisions are ultimately made by those equity and EJ communities, because within the electrification space, the decisions have largely not been made by those communities, and we have the most at stake. And so that's really how we view equity within our community of practice.
Thanks, Isa. How about EVHybridNoire, Terry?
I think that Jamez and Isa did a really good job of really illustrating what equity is. I think that when we think about it, it is, communities being able to be equitably the beneficiaries of whatever systems there are that are in place, and looking at how different sectors can benefit in a way that is comprehensive. One of the things that we've seen in the space is that this conversation, or this term equity, keeps getting thrown around, and it means so many different things to so many different folks. We are working on projects where we walk in and day one, folks are like, yeah, we've inserted equity into the project because we converted our collateral to Spanish. And the idea is that equity is much deeper than that. It is much more intrinsic in ensuring, as was stated earlier, that all segments of community, whether those be racial and cultural, whether those be rural communities, whether there be all different facets and sectors of community, have the same benefits to this cleaner and greener transportation system as we move forward.
All right, fantastic. And just a reminder that please put your questions into the chat, and we'll cover them. We have plenty of questions on our end too, but want to make sure that we do have a chance to hear from the audience as well and answer your questions. I'll move on to the next one, and this was partly covered by the first question, but can you talk about what your organization is doing to incorporate equity into your transportation electrification efforts? And let's start with Isa this time.
Yeah, happy to get started. So, I'm still relatively new to the Greenlining Institute. I'm in my 10th month now. So I'll share out a few of the projects that we're working on doing this that I'm most familiar with, but there's a whole team that's working on this that, I'm happy to share some resources and links to as well as we get later on in the panel that will further illustrate what we're doing. But, the things that I've really noticed and been, most excited about within the mobility equity team at Greenlining are, our work with the Charge Ahead Coalition, a group of 5 organizations in California that have really, teamed up for the past 8 or 9 years to be able to advance equity within California's clean mobility pilot programs. We've been able to really kind of ensure that equity is being in the conversation throughout the conversation when it comes to these mobility pilot programs. And there's still a lot of work to do. There's still a number of mobility pilot programs that aren't doing great on equity, and there are those that that we have been able to see some success with. So that's probably one of our biggest efforts to do this. And then connecting that to the Team Community of Practice project, the Charge Ahead Coalition really was the impetus for the development of this project, because out-of-state organizations and funders were seeing the success of California in being able to advance equitable, clean mobility. And we were asked by organizations and funders to do this work and share this work with other states. Of course, that's not really how Greenlining works. We don't see it as the best approach to try to go into other places where we're not based and try to advance work. We see the importance of actually making sure that the work is fed in from the grassroots up, from the ground up, from folks who are living in those communities, in those states throughout the country. And so that's kind of where this opportunity emerged of doing a community of practice where we can actually build community, build trust within organizations, and build networks across the country to be able to share out what's been learned in California and the challenges that we've run into, so that other states can hopefully learn from some of the challenges that we've run into. But on the flip side, also be able to learn from other states, right? California is not the end all be all of electrification. There are many other opportunities and ways and things that we can learn from other states. And so it's really a two-way learning process. And as part of this work, we are trying to integrate equity into the electrification process by providing funding, providing resources for our equity and environmental justice organizations. So we make grants of $25,000 to $100,000 available for this one-year project for our equity and EJ groups to be able to fund a staff member, or to be able to have the financial resources necessary to do this work, because it is time consuming and it can be complicated, and there's a lot of jargon and technical information that needs to be learned. And so that's another key aspect, is making sure that we are spending time translating what the issues are. That's been a big learning, is that a lot of our equity and EJ groups that aren't necessarily working directly in electrification right now, they need to understand, or at least be kind of guided in terms of understanding like why this issue really matters. For many of the communities that we're working with, we've heard that in some cases they don't even have access to safe sidewalks or biking infrastructure, frequent bus service. So it's like, how do we communicate and get on the same page about why electrification matters and why we should have all the above? We should have sidewalks, bike access, and clean mobility, and they really go hand in hand. And so we're trying to make sure that we're translating those issues and taking our time with the community of practice, as opposed to trying to come in and just advance electrification right away. We want to translate the issues and create that buy-in and create that trust early on.
All right, fantastic. Terry, what's EVHybridNoire doing to incorporate equity into your transportation electrification efforts? It's kind of everything you do, but yeah, maybe some specific examples for the audience.
Yeah, thank you. It really is at the core of what we do. We are, an organization that is focused on cleaner and greener multimodal transportation electrification, everything from e-bikes and scooters all the way up to, school buses and medium and heavy duty and everything in between. And so some of the things that we've been working on is we've been really ingrained in this conversation of advancing beneficial public policy at the state level. We've been engaged at the local, state, and federal levels. We're working with 25 cities across the country as a part of the American Climate Cities Challenge, working with state agencies across the country to advance equitable and diverse transportation electrification efforts. And at the federal level, we've been engaged with a number of legislators on the Hill to really begin to think about transportation electrification in a more comprehensive way. At the local, at the grassroots level, being a membership organization with members and chapters throughout the country, we have that ground level insight to what the benefits as well as what the barriers are to transportation electrification for communities that have often been left at the margins of these conversations. So we've been pulled into a number of different convenings. We're working on equitable infrastructure deployment in a number of areas. And actually, in the Midwest and Midcontinent, we're working on pilots and programs from California to Florida. We're working on workforce and economic development projects to really ensure that as communities are engaged in this conversation, that it's not just at the consumer level, that they also have those opportunities to change their economic outcomes, as well as address transportation burden. Our co-founder is a former medical school professor who has actually published quite a bit of work on the social determinants of health and understanding that those very communities that have been, burdened by the historic and systemic issues are also those who are really burdened by the public health issues that come along with that. So what we've really been drilling down into like the public health side of this to ensure that when folks ask the question, why are electric vehicles important? Why are electric buses important? Why should we have more e-bikes and scooters? One of the most immediate responses to that is it's the public health crisis that no one is really talking about. We're doing quite a bit of research around this as well. We know that for many segments, it's going to take a data-driven approach. And so facilitating this research to understand the attitudes, knowledge, and beliefs of communities around multimodal electrification is, some of the, and that's just some of the areas in which we're engaged. I'll kind of stop there and we'll get more into it during the breakouts.
All right, great. Jamez, you want to highlight any work your organization is doing?
Sure. So when we talk about the opportunity in the climate change space, we focus, obviously we're a developer, so we develop projects, but this facility, this training facility, which we've been working on for the last, I want to say roughly 7 years, which it should never take anybody 7 years to do something that means as much as this has the ability to do in terms of impact. What we've done is we've acquired a 22,000 square foot building that sits on the highest transit line in the state, highest used transit line in the state of Minnesota. And the goal was to initially just go straight to a new building, but why do that when you have an existing building you can use? So we have acquired this property. We have made some of the physical infrastructure improvements, which include putting solar on the roof of it. We've got battery storage system that will be deployed that will tie directly to one quadrant of the building. We've got a complete stormwater retrofit that's going to manage 100% of the stormwater on site. We're deploying electric vehicle charging stations on the parking lot. We're also putting heat pump that will put the gas utility on standby, so that the building itself serves as a living laboratory for students, young people, as well as adults to learn from. And so we're utilizing some of the funds from the Volkswagen settlement that we will be putting these EV charging stations on site. But the goal here for us is to bring a better understanding, right? Like acknowledging that we have all these disparities in Minnesota. How do we tie, how do we use this building for just more than one use, right? Not just for, solar training, but not just for EV charging infrastructure training and exploration, but like, how do we bring this climate change conversation to the forefront of these communities that haven't traditionally been engaged in that discussion? When you think about it as a poor person, take whatever your status is at this point in your life, remove that from your mind, and put yourself just imagine yourself as an economically challenged person who worries about paying the light bill, right? You're not thinking about saving. Ideally you'd be thinking about turning the lights off, but you're not thinking about the type of light bulb that you're using. You're thinking more so about, do the lights work, right? And so the objective here is like, if we can tie this, like I said earlier, to the purse strings, if we can show them what energy efficiency is, how it works, how they can save money by being more efficient, right? But then at the same time, show them that they can get the necessary skills and the training to actively participate to work in the industry. Now you've got a story and a narrative that actually changes the trajectory of someone's life. So, and the same thing with these vehicles, right? We're going to have EVs on site that we want to use in partnership with our car for the purposes that people can, if they don't have a car, they can use it. They can use that. We're connected by way of not, like I said, the bus rapid transit system. That's the highest use, but we're also getting a $75 million bus rapid transit system that's going to go from Brooklyn Center, where unfortunately the young man was murdered, all the way to the Mall of America. And every 10 minutes, a bus will stop out front. So, what we're doing is we're focused on the whole experience around energy efficiency, climate change, mitigation strategies, and creating the centralized point where people can actually engage and understand what it is. Come and get some information, understand what an EV is, understand what it takes to get a charging station, understand how you can tie solar directly to a battery and you can charge off peak hours that will tie directly so that you won't necessarily be paying the highest amount for that power that you would use when you're using your EV. So we are like, we're in this different, very kind of two different spaces, right? Physical infrastructure and physical equipment and materials that will help people to get to where we need them to get to in order to mitigate climate change. So that's what we're doing. We are working with our nonprofit organizational partners and they're tying directly. They do the educational components. We do not run programs. And so the students will have the ability to get high school credits as well as college credits, working with two organizations that we're working with. And then they'll also be workforce ready. As we know, we have a ton of electric vehicle infrastructure that needs to be built up and developed throughout the whole country. And so without the workforce being, more diverse, right, we're not going to get there. And so obviously Minneapolis is one area that we are in right now, but I encourage anybody that in wherever you may be, Midwest, West Coast, East Coast, to think about how you can tie these economic opportunities to folks to their lifestyle so that they can ultimately buy an electric vehicle. Because if they don't have a vehicle now, we want them to do more adoption of these vehicles.
All right, thank you. Now we are starting to get a lot of questions in the chat. I appreciate that. So I'm gonna jump over to some questions from the audience. And I think at this point, I'm just going to throw these out to the panel and let the panelists decide which ones they want to address. We can hear from everybody or we can hear from one person, kind of depends on your preference. So first question here, there are energy, looking at the experience with energy efficiency programs. We have energy efficiency programs that have carve-outs and budgets for lower income financial support to enhance energy-related equity, but oftentimes you struggle to get participation in those programs. How do we avoid similar results for EV-specific equity programs? What are we doing wrong? How are we not reaching people that need the programs?
I personally think we should do like a cash for clunkers thing all over again. People who drive the most inefficient vehicles are mostly the poor people. And so if we can think outside of the traditional paradigm of people who would normally qualify for a vehicle and think about how we create these pathways to vehicle ownership or shared vehicle ownership, I think that we'll have a better shot at more adoption. When I think about the way that we did our Made in Minnesota solar program, it was a lottery and you applied and you got public funding. We should be able to utilize some of these SIP programs, which is conservation improvement programs in Minnesota, to help bring energy efficiency to some of these areas. We should be doing the same thing around electric vehicles. I mean, we should be doing the same thing to make adoption more widespread. And personally, I think the people who are the most economically challenged should be able to adopt these things first. That's just the way I think about it, period.
Anything from Isa or Terry?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one too. I completely agree with Jim's points about making sure that these programs are really budgeted and set up to be accessible by the lowest income communities first. And that's a challenge that we've run into in California. Is some of our clean vehicle incentive programs really set the bar too high in terms of what someone's income can be in order to be able to access the program. And so you end up seeing a lot of folks who really don't necessarily need this incentive using it in order to get more luxury, higher end electric vehicles, as opposed to the communities who really could benefit the most from it being able to access a used electric vehicle. We need to make sure that our programs are set up to be able to purchase a used vehicle with a large enough incentive to make it such that it's cost parity with a traditional vehicle. We also need to provide money on the hood of the purchase so that someone's not having to wait for a reimbursement after a purchase. And we need to make sure that there's not so many requirements to be able to access these incentives. In some cases, you may have to fill out a form that could then be reported as income, which may disqualify you for other services such as SNAP or other services that require you to report your income. So those are a couple of things, a couple of tweaks that we can make to make sure that our incentive programs are more accessible to the communities that need them the most.
Go ahead. I'll quickly close this out by just saying I think perspective is important. So the last part of the question where you ask what are you doing wrong to get the folks in need, in the most need to capitalize on available programs. The idea is that messenger matters. And so as Jamez was saying earlier and Issa mentioned, the idea is that folks have other priorities at different times. So we can't expect that a person who is dealing with a pandemic, economic downturn, all of these things will prioritize the same things that we're prioritizing. And so if we have those relationships that have been developed with communities, community leaders, community-based organizations, we'll be able to communicate it out in a different way. In addition to that, we have to realize that policy is not the magic bullet that's going to solve all the issues. You actually have to have folks that are in these communities that are trusted messengers that can begin to convey why this is important and why we should be thinking about this. And without that, you're not going to get the adoption rates. There are programs across the country. We talk about California. There are many examples, in California where, it's some of the best policy in the country, but when you look at adoption rates in Black and Latinx communities, it's abysmal. So the idea is that we have to really begin to do some things differently, and we have to understand that the message is really important, but the messenger is even more important, ensuring that as we think through these things, you can't just start this process and say, oh, we developed this program. You have to have a continual ongoing communications loop with communities and community-based organizations and leaders, so that you become a trusted partner and not just someone that is parachuting into a community because you have this new shiny penny that you think is going to be best for them.
Yeah, and I want to add on to that, and we can move to another question. So one of the things that the city of Minneapolis did was they issued an RFP for a low-income community solar garden, knowing that low-income and people of color were not engaging in the solar space, right? So what they did was they issued an RFP. My company won the RFP, and what the city did was they said, basically, you got to do everything yourself, but we will be a backup subscriber, meaning that we will. They don't have to have any credit score checking. They don't have to have a down payment, and it's a pay-as-you-go program. And what that's doing, because we're finally at the point where we're starting to do subscriptions, is that is opening the door and saying, as a person from the community, right? Because the messenger is important, right? As a person who built the system, in addition to have people from the community actually engaging and making money off of the system, it creates a different type of conversation. It creates a whole different synergy. And we fought, right? We fought to have this low-income community solar garden put on the rooftop of North High School, which is in North Minneapolis, opposed to a city of Minneapolis building that's elsewhere, right? So like with all these points that are being made, it's absolutely imperative that you are engaging, not just on a one-off basis, but on a regular basis, checking in, a continuous dialogue happening amongst these community members and these organizations, and starting to help stand up people in the community that have a strong interest to actually create another organization that could be supported by the existing organization that's out there, so that they can stand on their own too. Because just constantly coming in and giving people something and then going away, giving and going away, it doesn't work, right? So we got to be more intentional about how we empower the community to actually engage and actively participate, and then help them to do what they want to do.
I think I'm gonna jump around a little bit and kind of follow on that theme. So there's been some discussion here about the idea of having community ownership stake. Are there EVSE companies that have something like a franchise model where communities could have some investment or ownership stake, maybe could be responsible for maintaining and marketing and profit from public charging? And open that up to anyone.
I'm not familiar with it, but I think it's a great idea. I think cooperative ownership will ultimately spur the adoption a lot faster. Ultimately, what will happen is people will see the financial benefits. This again goes back to entrepreneurship, right? When people are invested and they have a stake, they are more apt and willing to use and encourage others to do the same. It's like a cooperative model. I mean, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'll quickly jump in. So it varies. The answer to that question is it varies from state to state. So the idea is that if you look in the more progressive areas and the more mature markets, you have opportunities where municipal utilities, EVSEs, and others are partnering with community centers, tribal centers as site hosts, and there is a revenue share model that is garnered from that. The idea in those states that are not as progressive, where energy use is regulated, that becomes a very different construct. And so I think that as we mature in this space and we think about electric vehicles as not just modes of transportation, but energy sources, as V2G and V2X begins to continue to mature, there will be policy put in place that will help regulate that. And so the idea, or to make that a lot more amenable for communities, I think it is a great idea. If you think about energy, if we begin to think about energy as a community resource, and the energy that's stored in batteries from not just light duty vehicles, but mass transit buses and school buses, to provide, help with peak load and being able to get communities to lower rates because of time of use. I think that there's so many opportunities that come along with that. But I think that, it's up to us to really begin to push regulators in the space to begin to think about things in a lot more progressive way.
All right, thanks. Another question here: how do we measure success with respect to equitable clean mobility? What are the key metrics?
I can take one shot at this one. I think something that we're seeing with the new administration, the Biden administration coming in and creating a lot of buzz and momentum and excitement around climate justice and clean energy infrastructure. I think that's really amazing and that we should be excited and taking advantage of those opportunities. However, I think that we should really learn from the Obama years and how there was a lot of excitement and buzz and federal top-down opportunities and programs that were created that then essentially, and in many cases, wiped out or really limited by the Trump administration. And so I think it's really important that success is measured by what we're able to do from a grassroots level, from the community level up. And we need to be making sure that we're focusing on all approaches really at all levels, local, state, regional, and federal. But I think that it's really vital that the solutions that we develop, the programs that we create are really fed in from the community level up, from local and state levels. And then that can then inform the federal approach, because we know that that's where the best solutions, the most important solutions often lie, is in those communities where they can be sustained, they can be supported, and they're actually relevant for those local communities. So I think that we should be measuring success, not just by what the new federal administration is doing, or what they're able to pass in terms of a new budget or a new amount of charging infrastructure, but how engaged are communities in being able to actually shape and design the infrastructure that comes into the communities, the decisions that are made, the transportation options that are provided. I think there's some pretty good examples in both Oakland and San Francisco, the Oakland Bike Plan, SF Connect. I can share links to these really, really good examples of measuring how they were able to actually engage with community as part of those planning processes.
And I would just kind of jump in and say that I think success is measured in a multifaceted way. I think that at its core, I would say that, access to mobility or access to cleaner and greener mobility would be success for all different facets of community. So that essential worker that lives on the south side of Chicago, the south side of Kansas City, or the south side of Minneapolis, whatever the idea is those folks having access to cleaner and greener transportation is I think critically important. Public health outcomes, making sure that the historic and systemic challenges and barriers that we've all seen across the country are addressed so that folks are living in an environment with cleaner and greener air quality. I think that when we think about this in its true multimodal sense, it's not just light duty vehicles that are going to be the panacea or answer to all of the questions. It is, in some instances, it may be e-bikes and scooters. For other communities that, maybe more rural communities, is car share program. For other communities, it is access to non-essential, healthcare visits. Like all of those different things, to me, are metrics for success. And there's not one thing that I would look to, but really providing access to mobility that is cleaner and greener to facets of the communities that are often left at the margins of those conversations, to me, is how I see success.
So I'll jump in and kind of just give a very brief response. I personally think we should be looking at the economics of these economically challenged communities. Where we sit right now, this is like the Industrial Revolution all over again in relation to all these climate change mitigation strategies and the opportunities that it presents. And I think that if we can move beyond trying to accommodate low income and start trying to include them in the economic opportunities, it starts to change the narrative, and you'll see more broader adoption of all these, be it technologies of EVs or infrastructure or adoption of clean energy at large. And so that will, when we start seeing the uptick economically, I think that and more of these green jobs coming to bear, I think we'll see that'll be a great way to measure.
All right, great. Well, I want to call people's attention. There's some great back and forth happening in the chat, which some of these questions are getting answered live. So appreciate that. Some really important issues being flagged as comments as well. Issue of higher auto insurance rates disproportionately impacting certain communities has been flagged. Issues related to disproportionate impacts of pollution on certain communities. So a lot of great discussion. Like to kind of narrow in on this region. And so, for all of our panelists, are there any issues you can think of that, particularly need to get addressed in Midwestern states and communities? Anything, from your experience that we should really be thinking about?
Well, I'll be frank with you. I don't have an EV, but friends that do have them, they said that there's been some challenges with the batteries and you using them in the wintertime. I think we got to get better technology so that these vehicles will operate better in these cold climates. I know that's not our issue to try and address here today, but that's something that clearly needs to be something needs to be done about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly communicating accurately to people so it's not a bait and switch, so they understand what to expect.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the case in other mid-continental states, but I have heard in the South, as well as definitely in Michigan, there are electric vehicle fees that sometimes are being placed on purchases of electric vehicles. And that's like, it's just such a deterrent for someone to want to purchase a car when they have to pay an additional fee that they wouldn't have to pay for a traditional, gasoline vehicle. I think that's the kind of thing that we should see. Maybe it's not a simple fix, but to me, it just seems like something that's just nonsensical to have that kind of a fee.
Yeah, so I would say all of the things that were mentioned and more. I think that, as someone from the Midwest, when I'm back home and visiting my mom, I rarely see EVs. I think that we have to do a better job of normalizing transportation electrification, whether that be electric buses, bikes, scooters, cars, what have you. I think we have to do a much better job in the Midwest of normalizing it around the benefits. So if you think about, in the chat, Charles mentioned used EVs. We have members who have purchased an EV for $4,000 or $5,000. It meets their everyday needs. But the idea is that if you are Keisha, Kevin, Maria, Jose, and you live in any of these areas or markets, and you don't know that an EV is viable for you, and you don't see these vehicles, why would you make that choice? So the idea is that we have to really do one of the things that we are strong advocates for is real world engagement. One of the things that we do with our membership is we partner with a number of stakeholders in this to actually have folks in these communities who drive EVs every day go into communities and talk to their friends, the folks they went to high school with, the folks they went to church with, the folks that they see at the grocery store. Normalizing EVs. As a person that drives an EV every day as my daily driver, my normal routine is if I'm going to the drugstore or to the grocery store or wherever, I know that I need to allot at least in the extra half hour, because when folks see somebody that looks like me getting out of an EV, there's a number of questions that come along with that. And being able to address those questions in a real world way is critically important to the success of accelerating EV adoption and making it a lot more simple. And then the third thing is that we have to really understand communities. In Black and brown communities, vehicle ownership is critical to workforce opportunities, but at the same time, it's not as utilitarian. There are very few communities that you go in and you go into Black and brown communities and see a ton of Subarus. Subarus are great cars, but we have to understand the nuances of the communities in which we are dealing and why. We've been doing quite a bit of research around the country. So we've gone into many of the top markets around the country to look at attitudes, knowledge, and beliefs around transportation electrification. And it really comes down to, exposure and knowledge base. And many times, folks, this is a frontier technology that folks just literally have not been engaged with. And I think it's going to take a lot and more to begin to normalize this for communities.
A couple questions I want to raise up here and before we wrap up. So definitely got a couple comments about rural electrification. Do you have some ideas on recommended approaches for electrifying rural communities for anybody?
Yeah, I have an example I could speak to in the California context. There's a program called the Ecosystem of Shared Mobility in the San Joaquin Valley. And this project is a three-pronged approach, which includes an electric vehicle car sharing option, volunteer ride sharing service, and a mobility as a service platform that allows for planning and or payment for fixed and demand responsive transit service. And I can share a link to this kind of more information on this, but I think it's really great because it is responsive to the needs of rural communities, which may not have access. Like if a rural person in a rural community doesn't have access to a personal vehicle, just having a bus option may not be enough. There needs to be a variety of options that can meet the given transportation that may come up as a surprise, or maybe they need to travel as a group, maybe they need to make multiple stops. So having an ecosystem of mobility options that are at least somewhat affordable, consistent, and the information on them isn't too hard to access is really important. And this program is using variety of digital tools to be able to educate the community about the program. And they really did a good job of informing the community about it, as well as engaging them in the development of it. And so Greenlining has actually been able to kind of analyze the equity considerations of 12 different programs in California, not just this rural one, really a variety of programs. And so I'm going to share that report. And within this report, there's a lot more information about that particular program and recommendations from Greenlining about how it could be improved and how other states can take advantage of these programs and other programs that are similar.
Yeah, I would say that the rural conversation is something that we have to put a lot more emphasis on in thinking about it in a comprehensive way, when we know that rural communities typically the commutes are a lot longer. There are a lot less access to transportation. Depending on what region and area of the country you're in, what we have found in working in rural communities is that going in with these preconceived notions of what is happening. We worked on a program. We've worked on several programs where we've learned quite a bit. There were programs where folks were like, oh, we're going to create a car share program. One of the findings and one of the key things that came out of that is that without engaging community and not knowing where community is, having a car share program where you input your credit card into an app and you have access to a low cost vehicle is great. But what happens if those folks are unbanked? So the idea is that really when you begin to work with communities, you begin to understand the nuances of it. To Isa's point, San Joaquin Valley has a number of different programs. You have Greenlining, the Mio Car, a number of other programs that are there that have really been well thought through that provide clean transportation options for folks that live in these communities. If you go to, there are some really good examples in other parts of the country as well. In North Carolina, you have a program that's looking at a small rural co-op that is providing access to vehicles and flat rate EV charging. In other parts of the country, you have folks that are really thinking about this. They're providing non-essential medical transportation to folks because they understood that, to get to the dentist, to get to the doctor, to get to, other essential appointments, it was very difficult. It was a lot more difficult for folks than those in rural communities than those who live in urban cores. Education, coming back to education, many of the folks that we've engaged in rural communities just don't see EVs as being a viable option to them because there's this misnomer that batteries aren't this, batteries aren't that. The average new vehicle that's coming out today has at least 200 miles of range on the battery for almost all the cars that are coming out. Obviously, there are some that don't fall within that window, but the idea is that, as we look at rural communities as well as urban communities, we're going to have the innovation, technology, price per kilowatt of batteries is continuing to drop. We're going to see a proliferation of that. And then, in the next 18 months, you're going to see electric pickup trucks come in. And then I think that as well as in urban cores and rural communities, you're going to see an uptick of electric vehicles in rural communities just by that alone. An electric F-150 and other vehicles coming out, yeah, that'll change the paradigm pretty quickly.
All right. Well, there's definitely more questions here than we have time to answer. We are at the end of the time for the panel discussion. I want to recognize a couple questions here about just global supply chain issues. We don't have time to get into that, but I think that our panelists would say that equity related to the EV supply chain, global supply chain is crucial as well, and there's real issues to work through and talk through. And so we may just have to save that one for another venue. So at this point,